Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here for today's Ironclad webinar on legal metrics. We're so thrilled that you're joining us, and I see that folks are already starting to put in the chat where they're here from. Oh, Dustin, my old Patreon buddy, is here. We've got New York in the house, Colorado, Texas, Kentucky. Amazing. Kansas City, I see everybody from all over the country. We are so thrilled that you're here with us. Good morning and good afternoon to most of you. My name is Jasmine Singh, and I am General Counsel at Ironclad. I am thrilled to be your moderator today. I joined Ironclad about a year ago, and I have the honor of leading our amazing legal team, which operates as customer zero of Ironclad. That means that I have the honor of walking down the halls of this building that I'm sitting in today, pondering aloud about my hopes and dreams for contracting. And luckily, I have a host of people that are passionate about making those dreams a reality. And I genuinely mean that. Here at Ironclad, we are really passionate about legal tech, but we're even more passionate about building community among lawyers and empowering people in the legal profession to do their best work. And that's why it's such an honor for me to get to host this quarterly webinar where I get a chance to meet and talk to incredible legal professionals about the ways they are innovating in, leading, and changing the practice of law. And one of the most integral ways that folks do that is actually through metrics and data. So today we're going to be talking about how legal teams and leaders think about metrics we need to collect in order to demonstrate our strategic impact, how to report on those metrics, and what actions to take in light of what we learn or glean from those metrics. And I am joined by the incomparable Mike Russell, who's the head of legal ops at Expedia, and Sean Houston, who's the head of legal ops at Heineken. I'm going to let each of them introduce themselves in just a little bit more detail. So Mike, I'll hand it over to you to kick us off.
Sure. Thanks, Jasmine. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. Mike Russell. I've been leading the legal operations function here at Expedia, based in Seattle, for the last 5 years. I've been in legal ops generally for about 25 years, which is pretty wild. Gotten to kind of grow up in the industry and see how things operate, and also proud to be an Ironclad customer.
Sean, over to you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Houston. I'm the head of legal operations here at Heineken. I've been with the company a little over 4 years now, and largely responsible for all of the day-to-day workings and operations and tools and technologies that the legal team is using, both here at our headquarters in Amsterdam and globally at our 80 plus operating companies, and also a proud Ironclad customer. So glad to be here today with you and looking forward to it.
Amazing. Thank you both for spending this time. I'm so thrilled for this discussion. Before we dive into the reason we're all here to learn and talk a little bit more about metrics, I want to just pull up a level and talk about the why behind the what. Why are we talking about metrics? Why do we think that collecting and reporting on metrics is important, and what purpose does it serve? Sean, I'm going to ask you to kick us off with that, the answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the concept or the art of storytelling is, it's a crucial one. And as a legal team, it's imperative that we are, demonstrating the value that we're providing to the business. We're not simply viewed as a cost center anymore, but, we're a value adding, big piece of the business. And at least here at Heineken, and I assume other companies as well, the language that our CEO and CFO and the other execs understand best is data. So I think it's super important that we have metrics and data to back up our story.
Amazing. And building a little bit on that, the thought around, metrics and talking the language of the business, Michael, I'll ask you the same question. Why do you think it's important to collect metrics? And over your career, how have you seen that process influence the ability of legal teams to demonstrate their strategic impact?
Yeah, it really goes to Sean's point, visibility, accountability. For many years, legal operated as a little bit of a black box, I would say, and in some instances, and people just knew that work went in and work came out, and there was a cost to go with that. But here, we're now able to use metrics to drive process improvements. Are we able to figure out where there's bottlenecks in different processes? For example, points of friction when you're talking to your clients, the other business units within the company. And then finally, workload balancing. Everybody says, "Oh, I'm terribly busy. I need so much help. I have too much work coming in." But where are you actually measuring that? How much work? Where is it coming from? What's the complexity or the scope of that work? Why is it causing so much pain or burnout? It's every time we reach the end of the quarter. Now that we're into a new quarter for some of us on the calendar year, anyway. It's always that time of year when everybody's doubling down and trying to get everything in before the holidays. But are you really tracking that? Do you have the ability to illustrate that and visualize that? And that, to me, that's really the crux of it.
Okay, that's great. Now we focused on the why a little bit, and I'd love to drill in and start to talk about the how. So before we get into the actual nitty gritty of like how you execute on your strategy, let's talk a little bit about how specifically you think metrics actually prove strategic value. Like, what is it about metrics that get us to the point of being able to demonstrate a legal team's value to an organization? Mike, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to start with, where are we going? What's the end state we're trying to get to? Once we have the information, how are we going to illustrate it? What's the story that we want to tell? And then what's the information we need to be able to tell that story? And that has to underpin it. Again, back to what Sean said, that the language of the C-suite, the language of the business is really about data, and they want to make decisions based on that data.
Mm-hmm. Sean, same question to you.
Yeah, I think understanding your kind of end goal in mind is crucial. But why do these metrics specifically help us is, I would say, everyone loves a good story. And when you have some nice data and metrics to back that up, it creates an even more, powerful story and a more powerful narrative. And it's easier for people to remember. They can easily visualize it when you can put some numbers to it. And one thing I think is that for legal, that's, unique at least in the current moment, is that a lot of these metrics and data points, aren't really well identified or ironed out or accepted. And you're not, most places that I've seen and worked, not being necessarily told from the C-levels down on here's what you should measure and here's what we want to know. So we're in a bit of a unique situation that we have the ability to kind of craft what story do we want to tell and what metrics do we want to, report up and share out. And I think that is a very interesting thing that doesn't always exist. When it comes to sales, you're measured on, your prospects and the pipeline and then what you're closing. But it's not that cut and dry for something like a legal function.
Yeah, that's right. So that's actually the perfect segue into a conversation around what you actually track and why you track it and what story you're trying to tell with it. So oftentimes, when we're talking about metrics, we tend to focus on commercial and commercial legal first. So that's where I'm going to go to start us off in this conversation. And I think we've got two sides of the house for the most part that people are really excited about talking about when it comes to metrics. That's the sell side, revenue side, or the vendor procurement side. So let's start with the conversation on the sell side. Let's get really nitty gritty. Tell me, what revenue related metrics do you both track internally to be able to tell a certain story about your legal team? Mike, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I mean, at a high level, we've got quite a variety of things, and we want to be able to show speed of cycle time, which gets us to revenue, quality, and that's going to get us to risk reduction, efficiency, which potentially comes with cost savings. By being more efficient in my work in-house, maybe I'm sending less work to outside counsel, I'm applying AI, doing things like that. And then finally, the insight to make those better and more informed decisions. So I think those things are particularly important. Volume and value of deals, that kind of goes back to the workload balancing piece. Is the right resource working on the right type of deal? I want my most experienced people working on my highest complexity deals. That's probably obvious, but a lot of times people are going to jump in on things just because, that's interesting, I have capacity, but is it the highest and best use of their particular area of experience? And maybe it is, maybe it isn't. How much work we're doing using our standardized templates really comes into play, because that's work that hopefully doesn't even require legal review. There's a reason why it's a standardized template. It's been approved. It's been through SOX audit and controls and things like that, and people can just run with it. And if they're not modifying it, then legal doesn't even need to know about it. And so there's considerable time and cost savings coming to that. Review time for things that do need to come to legal. many companies may or may not have been tracking this before. If you have a story before, in a CLM driven world, if you know how long things were taking in legal before and after, then that's a fantastic story to tell, because it's almost always significantly less. If you don't have the baseline data, you can still show that incremental improvement, especially as you're moving from years to quarters to years since implementation. So I think that's a good one. And then finally, as you work with different kinds of partners, maybe there's discounts or commissions or things that weren't enforced or being enforced. So you need some buddy, some capability to take that downstream contract metadata and take action on it. Are my partners performing to the terms of the contract? Am I getting these discounts? Am I getting the proper commissions paid and things like that? And then all of that, of course, circles back to revenue recognition.
Yeah. I love that. Yeah, I'm going to try to bucket what you said a little bit into, there are metrics that help you figure out how much risk you're reducing for the company. There are metrics that help you figure out how much value or commercial or, obligation related value you can bring to the company by way of discounts, rebates, volume, et cetera. There are metrics that are going to help you track the efficiency of your team, resource allocation, who should be doing what work, et cetera. And then there's a separate bucket that's going to tell you a little bit about how well you're scaling, like how many contracts are subject to legal review versus how many are not. Sean, I'm curious to hear from you if you think of your revenue side metrics similarly, if there's anything else on a granular basis your team collects.
Yeah, I would say, spot on what Mike said, almost, 100% exactly what we're trying to accomplish and what we're measuring and trying to report out on. And then I think just by the nature of our business, there's some other more granular elements that we're looking at, for some of our operating companies around the globe, things like the tap percentage in a bar or a restaurant allocated to Heineken products, for example, could be an element of a contract. And that could be very interesting to the sales team in an operating company, particularly one where we don't have a dominant share and these sorts of things are acceptable, et cetera. So there's a lot of nuance to all of this within Heineken, but things like that are called out in a contract where they can be and where they should be, very interesting to help with. I particularly when we're coming up on renewals, is there something we want to change within that contract? Or for the sales managers to have discussions with their salespeople on what should be the targets, et cetera. So that type of thing was very hard to do, pre-CLM, and now it's very easy. We can just go into Ironclad and very quickly, within a couple of minutes, pull up a report, send it out, and everyone knows exactly what they need to know about contracts in flight, but also the ones in the repository. Just having the access to that really granular level of detail on volumes and other metrics about the actual sales deals is really powerful.
That's fantastic. We've got a great question in the Q&A, which is what specifically are risk metrics that you are tracking in order to be able to report to the business that your teams are helping reduce risk across the enterprise? Mike, I'll turn it to you to see if you've got any specific advice on that front.
Yeah, I mean, and that's a great kind of segue into, I think, the topic of risk, the balance of risk to what's an acceptable deal or what is an acceptable deal. And, I think the question that legal ops teams are really good at asking and hopefully answering is, is legal moving fast enough to enable the revenue without accepting what would be an unacceptable risk? So to be able to shine a spotlight on that, what I might call an operational sweet spot, what's that appropriate balance right there? You can certainly create, sort of an axis, if you think of the two axes, speed versus risk, and then categorize low, medium, high across all of those. And you've got your, very, very fast, low risk things are going to be based on your internal templates, things that don't require negotiation, things that are just basically a click to accept in a lot of cases. For those of us maybe that have online terms of use or something like that, I think that's a great one. And then you've got all the way up to your highly negotiated, bespoke type agreements where you're, maybe dealing with counterparty paper. And we all deal with, large entities where you're not on the forefront or the leader necessarily, and so you have to accept some counterparty terms. If you can calculate and track the percent of contracts that are executed without any clause deviation or requiring red lines. I think that's a good one, because that shows how much is going through based on your templates. And if you find that, gee, even our template driven work is still requiring an unusual number of red lines, well, then maybe the template needs to be tweaked. Maybe there's a couple of clauses in there that are just a little bit, you think they're standard, but they're maybe not standard within your industry. And that's where, talking to other Ironclad users or networking with peers can help adjust that sometimes. Another one would be to put a number towards your cycle time increase per deviation, so that if every time I have a non-standard governing law clause, indemnity clause, whatever it may be, if I can show that that's adding 2 days or 4 days to the review cycle time and ultimately to the revenue recognition, then that's going to maybe get the attention of the lawyers to say, gee, maybe this isn't that risky after all, and we should reconsider some of these, which would then update your playbook, update your templates, and then make it a little more accessible to folks to just accept it and move on.
Yeah, I think that's great, Mike, because what it does is it helps paint the picture of it's not just legal risk, quote unquote, that is being reduced, right? It's also risk associated with slowing down time to revenue recognition. And so I think that's also an important thing to deliver, as like we have actually reduced risk associated with longer deal cycle times by way of updating our templates to reduce thrashy terms or whatever it might be. So I love that perspective. Sean, I'd love for you to layer on and add if there's additional things from your perspective and how Heineken is using reporting and metrics on the risk side in particular.
Yeah, I mean, maybe even less sophisticated than what Mike just said, which is great, to identify, when a clause is non-standard and then the amount of time that adds on. I think that's a wonderful usage. Just simply being able to tell which of our contracts have ABC clause in them to the acceptable language. So not even what does that then mean for the contract time, but where is it present and where is it not? And then when renewals come around, what do we need to change about this contract, right? And just being able to very easily have that conversation internally, before we then discuss with the clients, or customers. But having the really, I'd say visibility into exactly what is in the contracts sounds simple, but obviously very difficult to accomplish. And that has been a huge win for us. And I think, identifying where counterparty paper is not being used and that's not acceptable moving forward is a big one for us. So like, as Mike said, sometimes it's inevitable. You're going to have to do it. But that should really be an exception for a company like ours. We should really enforce our Heineken paper as absolutely much as possible. And that helps on the risk side. It helps on the volume or the speed time. It helps on everything you can think of under there. Removes legal from even having to look at it. So it's that is like a real starting point for us. And it's a big goal of ours is to get that counterparty paper usage as small as possible.
That's great. One of the things that we do here at Ironclad using Ironclad that I think is pretty exciting is we track our negotiation of legacy contracts, similar to what you were just saying, Sean, about, trying to catch bad terms at the renewal phase. And what we do is we forecast out in the future quarter, this is our universe of contracts that we think are less than ideal terms. Like if we were to enter into those contracts today, we probably wouldn't have agreed to those terms. And then we can go tell our sales partners, forecasted out, like, hey, these are the 6 or 10 or whatever number of contracts that are going to come up for renewal. Give us some time. Give us a chance to fix those terms, right? So we can go to them proactively instead of in the middle of a deal cycle and interrupt it, right? And say, oh, now we need to try to renegotiate. So we have reduced risk by way of relational capacity, right? That's one way. And then another thing we do is every quarter, we actually report out on the financial risk reduced by way of that renegotiation of those legacy agreements. So if, for example, we had X number of contracts with uncapped liability for whatever reason, and we were able to cap those claims, we report out to say, now we've materially reduced risk by X number of dollars that were previously uncapped to now this cap. Or if we lower the cap from, a high number to a lower number, we can report out on that risk mitigation. So I think it's really exciting to be able to actually put numbers behind not just financial risk mitigated, but time to value risk mitigated, time to revenue risk mitigated, and also risk, with respect to the relationships that the legal team has with its very important partners across the business, which I think to each one of us who are ops minded is so, so essential to our success. So thank you so much for sharing all that. Mike, we started to talk a little bit about that vector between balancing speed and risk in deals. I'd love to sort of drill in a little bit there and talk about how specifically you measure that. How are you thinking about measuring, like at a very granular level, the right balance between reporting on speed versus risk in any given deal or across a set of deals?
Yeah, and at this point, I would say it's a little bit aspirational, right? So we've got the buckets, the high, mid, low, and we generally know in our world, which counterparties are going to be the high complexity, high risk, because they've always been the high complexity, high risk people. There aren't that many new entrants in some of these industries that are going to create that kind of complexity. So a lot of that is known. So the idea is to use the data that we have now that we're executing a lot of these contracts within the confines of the CLM. Now we know a lot more about them, and it's easier to sort of plot that on into their appropriate quadrants, as it were. So aspirationally, I would say I would like to be at the point where along comes a new partner. Now we have enough data to predict where that partner may land based on some of the terms they're bringing up, or the fact that they're marching in with their template and they're kind of insisting on it, and the value is such that we're considering going with the counterparty paper as an example. So I'd like to be able to do that. I think that's a little easier to do on the buy side again, because you often know, on the buy side what you're getting into when you're sourcing goods and services versus just out there looking for revenue. But I think it works on both sides.
Yeah. Sean, I'm going to slightly tweak the question for you to focus more on the outcome associated with that metric, the business outcome, right? Because a lot of what we do, and especially the framing you gave in the beginning, was we want to be able to speak the language of the business because it helps them understand a little bit better what legal does and the impact of what legal does. I'd love to tease out with you a little bit how what legal is doing is actually driving business outcomes. Like, what are you doing to use these metrics, and what metrics are you tracking to be able to show that legal is actually having an impact? And, how are you articulating what that impact is with respect to the actual outcomes that the business is trying to achieve?
Yeah. So I think the fact that we from legal own quote unquote ironclad within Heineken helps a lot, right? So we are the ones, driving this innovation and change across the business. Of course, not on our own, right? The vast majority of the users are non-legal, of course, but we're the ones really driving and pushing this. And so then we can really, I don't want to say take credit, but we, I guess, can for the great things that we are achieving. And we can really, say, look, previously it was taking 35 days for this operating company to get a contract from the first draft being created across the finish line to signatures collected. And now that number's 15. So we've, dramatically decreased the time. We've recognizing that revenue faster. That impacts the bottom line of the business. Also within Heineken, one of the big pillars at the moment, priorities for our company strategy is productivity. This ties in perfectly to that, right? So there's a lot of, I'd say, different ways that we can do that depending on the audience, if it's finance or commerce or procurement, slightly different conversations, but they're all relatively similar, right? Everybody at Heineken wants to have the best contracts we can possibly have for Heineken, the fastest way possible, and with the least amount of work involved, right? So I think it's a little slightly different message, but that's really the goal of everyone that works here. And I would imagine for most organizations, that is true. The strongest, best, fastest contracts.
That's great. That's great. And I'm going to pull us back out into a little bit of a meta question that's related to that, Sean, which is, it takes work to track metrics. It takes work to report on metrics, right? Tell me a little bit about the investment your teams are making and why you think that's a worthwhile trade-off. Like, why is your team spending time tracking, collecting, investing in actually reporting these metrics in this way? And because I think it speaks to what you just said about the business outcomes.
Yeah, well, I think maybe what we mentioned right at the beginning of the call, but we have to tell a story about what we are doing, right? If we're going to, request to spend money on a tool like Ironclad, or we're going to request to do some other project, rightfully so, we need to be able to come up with the business value case at the beginning and then show that value, after it comes to fruition and after, we've had some time to get it into place. And Ironclad is no different, and legal is no different in that sense. Like, this is kind of the way the business operates, essentially.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I think part of it is it's necessity. We're simply being required to do it. But also, I think from the legal operations side, that is one of the kind of core tenets of legal ops that I am a big, evangelist for, is the storytelling element. That, we have to get away from legal just being viewed as a cost center and that we're just asking for money for this tool. But no, instead, we're driving transformation across the business. We're allowing stronger contracts to get done faster. We're recognizing revenue faster. We're empowering the procurement team to operate within the guardrails that we've provided so they can get contracts in place faster. Like, this is all crucial to Heineken, again, to what we talked about a minute ago, meeting our business goals and to our company strategy. And legal is a key pillar of that. We're no longer, just kind of sitting back and waiting for someone to come to us. And I think that's imperative, that we're able to really tell that story, because no one's going to tell it for us if we don't do it. So we have to.
I love that. Legal is a key pillar of the company's strategy. That's a fantastic talking point that I hope everybody takes away. Mike, I'd love to hear a little bit from you about how you are using metrics to ensure also on the buy side, legal is in fact a key pillar in the company's strategy at Expedia.
Yeah, and definitely, a lot of folks, us included, started with buy side because we felt like we had a little more control and just knowledge around the way that particular function worked. So, legal and thus the CLM platform itself, we're helping the company get, tools, partnerships, goods, services, all the things they need to be able to operate efficiency, and then ultimately go out and seek the revenue that's going to keep the company operational and make the shareholders happy. So that goes to the efficiency and the productivity points, I think, that Sean already made. A lot of the metrics are very similar. When you look at buy side versus sell side work, a procurement cycle time is just as important to a sales revenue recognition cycle time, because procurement wants to get what the business needs as quickly, as efficiently as possible, but also in a way that makes economic sense for the company. That they equally, aren't going to enter into a deal that's not good or overpaying for something. I would say that volume and time spent in review, is the same. If we have standardized templates and you have an empowered sourcing team that's able to go out there and leverage those, then legal really shouldn't be involved very much of the time, because everything is so standardized, and in fact can even be self-serviced. If you look at things like NDA portals and things like that people don't even have to bother legal for 95% of the time, more than likely. Things like that, the speed and the savings element goes there. Are there discounts that we're claiming or not claiming based on terms that are in contracts? So that, again, gets back to good quality metadata. Do we even know what volume discounts perhaps that we're entitled to, early pay discounts, any of these kinds of things that may be in an agreement, but no one is actually enforcing it after the fact. So again, to your earlier topic of obligation management, kind of goes the same thing. So, at the end of the day, it's not just about signing the contracts right. We're ensuring the company is getting exactly what it is paying for, basically, for that good or that type of service. And why, and when you asked about why collect all the metrics, well, do we understand the business impact, the data ownership? Where does this stuff lie? How are we calculating those metrics? How often do people want to see them? Just because I have a weekly or monthly dashboard, does that cadence really fit with management decisions and when they want to change or make changes to what they're actually doing? And at the end of the day, is that data of high quality? Are we sure that whether it's human entered metadata or AI recognized metadata or calculated metadata, is it good, accurate, and people are able to trust it. Because the minute they feel like a dashboard or report doesn't represent reality, you've lost your credibility.
Yeah, I think that's right. And Mike, I think that's a great transition into the buy side conversation. And from your framing, it sounds like the buckets of metrics that you're tracking are pretty parallel to those on the sell side, but they just tell a different story to the business. Instead of how fast are you getting revenue, it's how fast are you getting the tools, equipment, services, whatever it might be, to actually support people in doing their jobs to ultimately go get that revenue. So I love that hook still back into revenue and the procurement of resources and the things we need to actually operate as a business. Sean, I'd love to turn it to you to get a sense of whether you think there's anything else on the procurement or buy side in particular, by way of metrics that your team is thinking about or tracking that maybe we haven't talked about because it's different from sell side deals.
Yeah, it might not be the most original thing, but one thing that has been really effective for us is just removing legal from even having to look at the contract as much as possible. And making that very clear to the procurement team. Look, if you're using a Heineken template Heineken paper on this agreement, you fill out the launch form and it gets created, legal doesn't need to see it, period. So take this, send it out, use it as is, and you don't even have to worry about legal looking at it. And to the extent we can just continue to harp on that and the benefits that has, that it's, one less person, one less reviewer that needs to take place, has been really helpful. And it's really helped with I'd say the excitement of the procurement team to get involved as well, because the legal team that supports procurement it's not a giant team. So we have to be able to support them faster. So again, it's not necessarily specific for procurement. Of course, that's also relevant for a sales team, but it has seemed to be quite useful in discussions with the procurement team. And of course, the legal team is also happy to not have to look at a contract that they've already approved in a sense, right? So it kind of helps everyone. In addition to that, there's the specific example of favored nation clause and where that is applicable in some of our agreements, and where that isn't in place. That's very interesting for procurement leadership, and where when a renewal comes around, maybe that's something we want to include in an amendment or something in the future. So just surfacing things like that. And then I hate to say it, but even very basic data points like what is our payment terms for this contract hasn't been easy in the past. So I might sound like I'm saying some very simple use cases here, but I imagine some other people listening to this are in the same boat, that it's not easy to tell this information if you don't have a system that can tell it to you. So just starting with those kind of basic points has been really helpful.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And one of the things we have found success on, and here in the teams that I've been on in the past, is layering that data to actually give a more nuanced read on the implications of where, the cost associated with the vendor, for example. If you've got one set of agreements where the term length is this on average, and the cost or, the annual fee associated with that purchase is this, and these agreements were done on our paper and they were done X number of days faster than the ones that had the same ARR, the same term length, but they were done on counterparty paper and the time to close was way longer, right? Reporting on that delta or the difference is a really powerful way to go back to your procurement team or even your purchasers if they're distributed across the business and say, hey, look, I know that your vendor is your partner, and I know that they asked you to use their paper, and I know that they told you it would be faster, but here's my evidence showing you that it's actually not faster, and why you should push for our paper to get it done. And again, I think that even on the procurement side, it speaks to that relational capital that legal can start to build by way of having these metrics at our fingertips. So Mike, I want to turn it to you to ask more specifically on your side, if there are any other metrics on the procurement side that you're tracking, either in order to gain that capital with your stakeholders or frankly, to get leverage with your vendors.
Yeah, I think, leverage wise, that, I talked about things like volume discounts and quick pay discounts and things like that. And we use that, whether it's a law firm, which is a big part of my vendor world, obviously from a legal ops perspective, or a software company. You know, they're all kind of the same from a procurement perspective. So if we're able to, you know, not just stop with, hey, these are the standard payment terms, but let's talk about what your business means to the company, and does it deserve quick pay, volume, things like that. And there's a lot of room there, and you can have a very standardized template with those kinds of options built in, and they can be very acceptable within the financial ranges that people are authorized to approve for. And then you've got the system keeping all those guardrails in place. So it's great to have, you know, once you're, you know, 100, 500, 1,000 executed contracts down the road, then you can look back and say, well, here's where these things came in helpful to help with the negotiation. Here's some economic realities that we've realized from those, or maybe here's something we thought was a great idea, but it turned out that the volume was so low, you know, it doesn't matter that, you know, some firms are giving us you know, I'm using the law firm example, but, you know, if I pay them within 2 weeks instead of 6 weeks, for example, is the amount that I'm saving there worth the work that it takes to make those payment terms happen? Depending on the way your AP system works. So that
Right.
Having that, you know, helps you go back to the use cases that sometimes they seem like a great idea, and then you realize, we really didn't realize that much benefit from it. But then maybe there was something else that we just tried, and then we're seeing significant benefit from that, and we want to expand or grow that. So I think that can be applied pretty much across the board. But again, if you don't have that baseline data, you wouldn't have that information to make those decisions.
Right. Right. And so now, speaking of the baseline data, I'm going to ask us to get nitty gritty for the folks in the room that are like, I actually want to figure out how to do this. I have never done it before, and I want to know how. Sean, I'm going to turn it to you to kick us off in this conversation, because you had the experience of transitioning your procurement contracts to a CLM. Tell me a little bit about how you actually set up your workflows to be able to track the data and decide on, you know, we talked a little bit about you deciding on the data that you wanted to track, but how did you set up the workflows and the system to get that data?
Yeah, so a couple of things I maybe already mentioned, but yeah, making legal not a required step in the approval process unless the document has been edited once it's created or it's a counterparty paper.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's one example, but just revisiting the entire approval flow of
Mm-hmm.
who was doing it before and really asking, okay, why are there 6 people reviewing this type of contract? And if the answer is, yeah, that's just how we've always done it, well, okay, what are our actual requirements here? And what do we actually need to happen on every type of contract? And where can it be optional? Where can we have those thresholds or those triggers to bring in legal or bring in finance or bring in an additional layer within the procurement team or whatnot? To actually review these. Or, yeah, in some examples for some operating companies, not having someone just click approve and then receive the document to sign and sign it, but maybe they can just sign it. If all they're doing is clicking approve, but everyone else has already approved it and they're just simply, you know, checking a box, let's say, but they're not actually looking at the document until they go to sign it. Well, let's revisit that. So, you know, things like that, just to help minimize the amount of people that are being asked to look at every single contract is one. And being really clear again on why we are asking this. So some kind of help text on some of the launch form questions has been helpful, and making people understand, like, what you put on this is what goes into the contract. So that way they don't rush through it to get it created and then edit it, but get it right the first time. Then legal doesn't have to look at it. But if you edit the document, then legal will, just as an example. And I keep harping on that use case, but we're really trying to remove legal from the equation as much as we possibly can for many reasons. But I think, things like that have been super helpful. But yeah, I think the legal ops lens of, and I wasn't part of, you know, setting up our procurement system years ago. So I can honestly ask, well, why is it like that? Right. And just constantly asking why and questioning, not just saying, okay, we're going to take this and do this exact same thing in Ironclad, but really trying to start from scratch in a sense.
Yeah, I think that's great perspective, Sean, because I think what advice you're giving to some of the listeners is really around making sure you're really thoughtful on the front end about what information you're collecting about any given contract, both in order to be able to more scalably develop the contract template and do it in a way that's automated and collect the right data to populate the contract, and build that workflow to be able to get the right approvers in the system so that you're not wasting people's time, i.e. you're not bringing in legal or you're not extending deal cycle time by bringing in legal if the approval actually is not required by way of whatever input is there on the intake form, because let's say there was not a change to a field that should necessitate legal review.
Exactly. Yeah. Or it doesn't exceed a certain amount. So we don't need the sales manager every single time. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Mike, I'd love to get that same granular level of detail from you about how you're thinking about how you thought about building your workflows to make sure you were actually getting the data that you needed, the metrics that you needed.
Yeah, and a lot of times when you sit down initially to onboard a team, they will say, "Oh, we have 700 fields that we'd like to capture," and then you have to kind of go the opposite and say, "Well, let's take a look at what data points do you actually need, particularly post execution, to manage to this particular type of contract. What decisions are you going to make based on it, and is it even realistic that if I have a multi-hundred point or question launch form, that gets confusing and onerous for people. So it does take some thoughtful planning, I think, to think about your future state. And a lot of times we'll have really old agreements, and people spend lots of time going through the old agreements and what do these say about this. And if you're lucky, maybe you have an AI tool to help with that. But at the end of the day, what is the data they're actually trying to extract? Is it more about harmonization across agreements to say, well, for this type of contract, these are the T's and C's and the clauses that we always want to be there? Great, I can build a template. I can help you build a playbook off of that. But when they come in and just say, give me the world of data, that's a lot harder to plan for. So I think sometimes reining in user expectations is good, and getting them to settle on what is the 1.0. I can always add more, but think about what do you need to actually get started. So what does our initial release look like? And then we'll come back again and we'll iterate and we'll do changes. And I think that's one of the powers of a great CLM is the ability to quickly iterate and make updates to things, even on the fly sometimes when you're in the middle of working with that. So I think that's important. A lot of times we've got data from other sources that can help calculate when things aren't happening. So a lot of times people will say, well, it's difficult to measure, what didn't happen. So we used to have contracts that were less compliant. Now we have contracts that are more compliant. But how do we really know that? And how could you maybe tell an auditor a story like that? So just because you have an absence of compliance incidents, well, what other supporting data goes to that? We've been doing more compliance training. My HR system tracks who's been through compliance training and how frequently they're going through compliance training. We have a compliance helpline, and I have fewer reports coming in from that. We have fewer contracts disputed from a legal point of view. And then you can say, well, we've protected this revenue, or we've protected the relationship with this partner as a result of having very compliant contracts through things like approvals and signatories and things like that. So I think just that back to that general consensus of being thoughtful and careful and not trying to do too much as you first get into it.
Yeah. I'm going to bring us back to the point you very well made about iteration and being able to change what you're doing over time. And I think even for us here at Ironclad, that's something that we've been doing. We recently went through an exercise, in case this is helpful for anybody to consider doing on their own, is we thought about what are the business outcomes that the legal team wants to help track towards. And then on a very granular basis, what are the metrics that help us show that we supported those metrics? And then we went through an exercise of where's the best place for us to track. Maybe some of those are in the intake form. Some of them, frankly, are for the reviewing attorney who ultimately approved the deal to track, right? Because they maybe are in the best position to know where the LOL or the indemnity settled, or whether we got a 24-hour breach notification on the security provision or 48 hours, whatever it might be, right? There might be things for the lawyer to track, and we want to do it the most efficient way. So we went through this very tiered approach of what's the outcome? What are the metrics that support those outcomes that we care about? And what's the best granular way to track each one of those things? Is it in the intake form? Is it, at approval stage? Is it somewhere later in the workflow? And so just being able to regularly revisit that conversation as your company grows and changes, and frankly, change your mind and say, oh, those things I actually don't want to track them anymore. So I'm not going to, and I'm going to deprecate those data fields for whatever reason, or I'm going to switch it and start changing how I think about measuring that value. I think is a really important exercise for all of us, especially, as we think about the incredible fast pace that all of our companies are growing at. So I think that's an amazing segue into the next sort of subtopic, which is all of the stuff that we do, all of the amazing work that our legal teams do that are not contract or commercial related, right? There is harder stuff sometimes to measure. And by harder stuff, I mean, it's more difficult to measure those things, especially in the world of employment work, compliance work, intellectual property, some corporate work. I'd love to hear from each of you a little bit about how you approach metrics in non-commercial work, where it might be harder to quantify. Sean, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it really depends, and that's a very lawyer answer for me. I'm not a lawyer, but yeah, it depends. I think, yeah, the topic of like resource allocation and planning is super, super critical for us. And we need to understand, yeah, what we can do internally, what we can leverage Ironclad for, what we need to outsource. There's also this topic within Heineken and other large organizations, the topic of hubs or shared service centers. And we're trying to understand what's the best way for us to bring that into our ways of working. And, Ironclad is a crucial element for us to empower the team here. And then, yeah, I think some of the challenge, of course, here is like, yeah, it's hard to kind of say what is happening or when it's not happening, right? And so from a compliance perspective, trying to show like we were able to avoid ABC issue because of this is difficult. And I must be honest, I don't think we have a great answer for that yet. The absence of incidents, quote unquote, is a difficult one so I don't know if Mike has any good thoughts on that or someone else. That's an area where I'd really like to get into next as we try to mature our storytelling. For employment, we're not using Ironclad for that yet. That is handled by a different legal team within Heineken, so I don't have anything to share on that. But yeah, things like for IP specifically, we have these trademark license agreements. We have hundreds of brands around the globe, and that has been a big animal that we've been trying to tackle here recently. So yeah, I don't have a super clear answer for you, but we're trying to do bits and pieces of all of that, I guess.
I think sometimes it's nice for folks to hear that it's a shared struggle. So at minimum,
yes.
Hopefully
trying to be as transparent and honest as possible.
Yeah, it's a really tough nut to crack. Mike, I'd love to hear your perspective. How are you thinking about non-commercial metrics tracking?
Yeah, and it's, even a few years into a CLM journey, we still feel like we're just sort of scratching the surface with what the potential truly is across the enterprise. So that's always interesting. We found a few creative ways to leverage Ironclad to capture things that I would say are sort of non-traditional. We were faced last year, for example, with compliance with Digital Services Act and some of the related policies over in Europe. And so at the end of the day, you need a repository that can collect information and certifications about partners, aka counterparties, and measure metadata about them. So, we kind of put our heads together and said, well, that kind of sounds like a CLM use case. So we figured out a way to basically leverage a lot of the capability that's already in Ironclad to do just that, even though those aren't necessarily executed agreements in the traditional sense. It's still information about counterparties, and we need to be able to track it, report on it. It has an expiration date. So, it just is an example of a use case, and a lot of the similar sort of metrics will filter out. And then thankfully, because of the very open and easy to use API, you can link that to downstream systems. I saw a question in the chat about Salesforce and things like that. And that's another great way where you can plug in to whether it's Coupa on the buy side or Salesforce on the sell side or some other legal system that you may have or other internal systems. The ability to do that, through either out-of-the-box connectors or APIs, then gives you access to all that contract metadata that can be used downstream. And,
Mhm.
and for example, in our world, I kind of alluded to it earlier, we're always wanting to be sure that of millions of hotels on the planet, are they all compliant with the terms that they've agreed with? Well, that's a significant lift to look at millions of agreements and understand that, are we collecting the correct commissions, for example? Are they honoring the room rate guarantee that they may have given? Things like that, it takes a lot of downstream information to do that. But to have that open platform and the ability to get to it in the first place, that really simplifies what goes on downstream or in adjacent systems that are leveraging the Ironclad data.
Fantastic. I'm going to transition us into something that we started to talk about earlier, which is one of the motivations for us in tracking these metrics, whether it's on the commercial side or the non, is actually to properly allocate and advocate for resources within legal to make sure that we are staffed and resourced to be able to do the best jobs that we want to do. So I imagine, given the timing of this webinar, it's October, most folks are either in annual planning or heading into it. And could use some very granular advice from two experts in the game. How do you think about making the case for resources for your respective legal teams in particular, based on some of the metrics, analytics, and data work that you're doing? Sean, I'll turn it to you to start us off.
Yeah, I mean, as I've mentioned ad nauseum, people are probably tired of hearing me see it, or hearing me say it. We simply cannot keep up with the goals and growth for the business and the amount of contracts that are coming in with the same amount of people on the legal side without leveraging technology like Ironclad. The volume is simply too big. And the answer is not just to keep hiring and hiring and hiring more lawyers. No one wants that. So yeah, the good news is the data coming out of Ironclad is pretty obvious, right? There's literally thousands of contracts every week going through the platform. And by leveraging Ironclad, we're able to remove legal from X percentage. We're able to increase the volume. We're able to make the legal review, when necessary, very obvious that they only need to look at, this one clause that has been edited, et cetera. And that has allowed us to kind of remain as flat as we possibly can. Without the need of having to bring on additional headcount. And we do, tell that story to the CFO. Like, yes, we are investing with Ironclad, but it has allowed us to avoid having to hire, 7 new attorneys in this region or something like that. So that is something we're doing. And then also, again, backing up the investment in Ironclad itself and that project, not just a time investment, not just a monetary investment, but also a time investment from myself and others, working on the project every day. So at a very high level, those are things that we are doing, and also avoiding having to go to outside counsel, which, as we all know, is extremely expensive, and really using that only when absolutely necessary. So those are a few things that we are trying to do.
Fantastic. Mike, anything different on your end?
Yeah, definitely the easiest justification is when you can say, well, here's a body of work that fits within, sort of what could be one individual's area of expertise, and I'm spending, 6 or 7 figures on it with outside counsel. Well, clearly I can replace that with an additional in-house head. And so that, I would say, justifying lawyer hires is probably easiest when you have the outside counsel spend to counterbalance it. A little harder when, for example, on the legal ops side, we're always looking at, well, what's all this sort of busy work that lawyers and paralegals and other people that aren't in legal ops have inherited maybe from the business, things that used to happen outside of legal, and either for quality reasons or reorgs happened and the work had to get done, so we just took it on, or whatever the case might be. Then all of a sudden you've got 10 hours a week here and 20 hours a week here, and all of that is as much or probably more than any one individual. And it's typically very operational work. It doesn't require actual legal oversight. There's no legal judgment being rendered, no legal advice is involved. It's just simply work that needs to get done to enable the business. And there might be that slight bit of legal component. When you can identify that, that's kind of the one of the secret sauces, I think, on the legal ops world, is to be able to find all of that across even a small to mid-sized department, and then put all that into a bucket and say, well, one, should this work even be done in-house? Should I be talking to my ALSP partners? Maybe it's better, best sent outside, because it's actually not career building, challenging, interesting work. It's so routine and so basic it doesn't even really deserve any in-house resource. That's category one. Category two would be it definitely needs in-house oversight, but it doesn't rise to the level of a paralegal or a lawyer. That's your sweet spot for legal ops. And so whenever I can build a case around that, and not to mention, as we go throughout the year, there's always the unpredicted. There's always the thing that happens that you just don't know. Something's going to happen every year. It always does. You just don't know what it is. New regulation, new compliance, M&A activity. Who knows what it's going to be? And to have what little bit of capacity you can spare to flex with that. And again, I highly recommend working with ALSPs and partners in the industry to do that as well. Then you really have to find that balance. But if you don't have the data around the work and the data around the spend, it's much more difficult to make that business case.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. And one of the things we've done here is we've looked at we've used our historical data quarter over quarter to know what kind of contract we're reviewing. And by kind, I mean, was it a contract, of a certain segment on our sales team, on our procurement team from a certain department that was the requester. And we've also looked at the level of legal involvement. So no touch, meaning legal just wasn't involved. It skipped legal review altogether. Low touch, meaning it was a clause that triggered legal review. Sean, what you were talking about, somebody edited something. And so that's the only reason legal got involved, not because it was actually a full negotiation. And then we went to our go-to-market analytics team and we said, these are our historical numbers based on the growth and pipeline you see. How are each of these numbers going to grow year over year next year? And then we layered on our scale plans on top of that and said, okay, based on the thresholds that we've got for legal review, the types of templates that we've got, the new bucket of work is going to be partially accounted for by way of scale, but we've still got this small bucket of excess contracts that we're expecting. We actually came up with a number, and then we said, based on what we know about our team's capacity, here's our potential thinking around when we're going to need to add new headcount and when we're not. And being able to speak that language to your earlier points of like, we're asking for headcount in a way that is actually parallel to capacity planning on the customer outcome side or on the, go-to-market side. Like, I just think that version of, using metrics about what work it is that we're doing to be able to make the case for resources is a really powerful one. I think that one of the questions that we've got a little bit of themes in the Q&A is like, how are you actually doing this? I see a question about how are you collecting new data on historical contracts? There was also a question about how are you combining legal metrics with data from other data sources? So I'm going to ask you both to if we could rewind just a minute back to that how, because I think it will be really powerful for some of the folks in the audience to hear, what specifically are you doing on a day-to-day to make sure that you are able to get this information for both historical contracts and get the extent of data that you need, including by way of these third parties. Sean, I'll turn it to you to start.
Yeah, for the historical contracts, we do leverage at times the smart import functionality and Ironclad to help us with tagging it. It's not always 100%, but we have a chance then to validate and make sure that it is. It saves us a ton of time for those English language contracts. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, either AI has to do it or a person has to do it. There's no kind of shortcut that exists. Someone needs to get this metadata about the contracts if you don't have them. Yep. Mike, we're getting close to end on time here, so I want to make sure you have time to respond as well.
Yeah, exactly the same. So we've been through a few 100,000, I would say, old contracts imported, and it's always a mix of human and technology enablement wherever we can. But at this point, you still need the human in the loop. So that's worked pretty well. On the data integration side, I would say work with, hopefully, if you have enterprise folks that are in the data lake business intelligence world, and they can help you with a Power BI or a Tableau or something like that. But that's really what you need to tie all that information together, whether it's Salesforce data, ERP, HR data, and of course your contract data. You use a BI tool and leverage it to do that.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, we're integrated with Azure Data Lake with Power BI, which is what the rest of the business. So that's us kind of meeting them where they live already. Yeah.
Excellent. And I think, I've got two questions remaining for each of you. One, I think, is on the top of everyone's mind, which is how are you using AI to buttress your work on the metrics analytics strategy side? Mike, you just started to answer, and Sean, you did as well. But if there's anything else specific you want to point listeners to about how you're leveraging AI, I'm sure they'd be excited to hear it. Sean, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm really trying to get AI assist out there and in the hands of as many people at Heineken as we can. You mentioned earlier, we recently went live with global procurement, and we are empowering them to use that tool as well, to help them with redlining. Because in reality, they are doing a lot of that and have been doing a lot of that on their own, and then legal is reviewing. So if Ironclad can help them with that, that's great. And it's not changing the behavior. Like, they were already doing a lot of this anyway. So that's been a big push from us. And yeah, having that be part of playbooks where possible is something I'm trying to do more and more of.
Fantastic. Mike?
Yeah, and ditto. I was going to say a lot of the trouble with playbooks is the time it goes to create the playbook. So use AI to prompt the creation of the playbook. That's the biggest thing we're sort of playing with right now. Is here's a bunch of completed contracts. You tell me what our playbook is, and let the machine do the work.
I love that. Okay. In the few seconds we've left, my last question for each of you is parting words of wisdom, lessons you've learned either from mistakes that you've made or things that you really want people to walk away from this conversation knowing. Mike, I'll ask you to start.
I would say number one, we're not alone. So leverage your peer networks, the Ironclad community, Clock, ACC, LegalOps.com, all these great peer networking opportunities that are out there. There's some wonderful books. This happens to be one that I was fortunate to contribute to, LegalOpsKPIs.com. I think Ironclad has an awesome KPIs handbook coming out. Just, the power of the community will take you far.
Thanks so much. Sean?
I like that message, Mike. That wasn't what I was going to say, but I wish I had said that. No, I would say two things. One is really start at the end and understand what you are trying to do, because that is, if you don't do that, you're going to take a lot more time to get where you're going. So have the end goal in mind. And then the second one I did not mention earlier, but Mike and you, Jasmine, both touched on it. So I want to make sure I say it. When you think about a workflow and the launch form, keep it as simple as possible and break that up where possible. So if one person doesn't have all the answers, you can structure it where they provide what they know, and then the next person provides the other details that they know, whether that's the customer or someone else within your organization. We've had that scenario come up a few times where one person was being asked to do everything. They didn't know all the information. It was taking too long. So that's also something that's really helped us streamline the process a bit on the contracts.
Awesome. Mike, Sean, thank you both so much for the time you've spent and the wisdom that you have shared with everyone. To all the attendees, thanks so much for spending this last hour with us. We will see you again at the next quarterly webinar. Have a great rest of your day.